All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our July 2025 CLA training and webinar. The topic today is 22,000 over 22,000 evictions in Minnesota each year. How did we get here? So this is part of our semi-annual evictions update. And with that, we'll get rolling here. So first off, what is Homeline? So we're um, a legal rights organization. And we have a tenant hotline, which you can see the number there. We offer our services in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong. And you can see the associated numbers with each of those hotlines there. As well, you can also email our organization at the link in the bottom of the page. Some brief housekeeping. So this session is being recorded. It will be available on our website, homelinemn.org, in a few days. If you have any questions while we're going through this webinar, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat located at the bottom of your Zoom window. And for any attorneys on this call, 1.5 standard CLA credits are being applied for after this session. So for the agenda, we have 2 parts. First part will be conducted by our data guru, Ozzy Nieves Rubio. He'll be talking about sort of the data behind evictions, right? So how do we collect this data? Sort of overview of eviction data, looking at regional breakdown and end of year projections, and then comparing our data with the eviction lab. And then part 2, Homeline Managing Attorney and Hotline Director Mike Draw will take over and talk about eviction laws, looking at pre-eviction protections, as well as some data on evictions before and after COVID, and then sort of a more philosophical discussion on why evictions are so high post-COVID compared to pre-COVID, and what has changed and what has changed the same. And so with that, we'll get rolling. So Ozzy, the floor is yours.
Cool. Thank you for that awesome intro, Philip. And yeah, like Philip said, I am Ozzy. I am the eviction data assistant here at Homeline. Um, so I collect the data every day and I put it together. I send out letters to tenants facing eviction. And then every once in a while, I get to put it all together here for the people to see. Yes, so that is what we're doing here today. So here, what we're looking at is essentially a skeleton of what I do. So starting from the left, I access MGA, government access, which is essentially the court system here in Minnesota. And I start by looking for cases for the day prior. So I look up each county individually, and when I get this total number of cases, I have to sort out all the non-eviction cases because I get all of the civil cases, right? And obviously, we can't do anything with any of the other types of cases, so we're only focusing on eviction cases. And then I'm able to plug those into Micro to obtain like specific case details, like the addresses where tenants are facing eviction, the case filing reason, names, that sort of thing. And then on the right, we see Homeline's total number. So I put it all into Homeline's system in there. Into the database. And so far, we're tracking 12,000 cases for the first 6 months of this year. And to compare that a little bit, so MGA right now, the court system is showing about 8,000 cases. So we do have a 4,000 case sort of difference between the two. And that might be for a multitude of reasons. I'm sure maybe Mike can get into it a little bit later on. But it could be anything from expungement to cases getting thrown out because of whatever, maybe the landlord didn't do something right, like the 14-day pre-eviction notice delivery date, which we'll get to in a little bit here. So a multitude of reasons. Yep, so next slide.
Ozzy, if I could jump in for 1 second. Philip, if you could
Hmm.
take us back. So basically what you're saying here is there are 12,192 evictions that have been filed this year versus the 7,926 number, which is what the court would say is still on record.
Yep, that is correct. Yep.
Okay, great.
Hmm.
Thanks.
Yes. Okay, and then here what we're looking at is the mid-year overview of last year and this year. So I'll explain a little bit about what we're looking at here before I get into the filing patterns. So that red dotted line that you see on the bar graphs, that is the pre-COVID baseline. So pre-COVID, we had about 60 filings per day, which just about totaled out to 1,500 cases per month. So that's what that red line is about. And we can kind of clearly see there already that we haven't been anywhere near that in a while. Sometimes we approach it, like for example, January last year, we had very low filings. In fact, we were below average during that January. And I'll just get into it quick here. The January, what the reason why that January was so low is because that's when the new 14-day pre-eviction notice law was passed. So sort of landlords and their attorneys were having to acclimate to that new rule. And then following January last year, we started to, go back to, business as usual, so to say. And then on the right there, we see the data tables. We see the difference, percentage change year over year between each month. And then obviously the big one there is January, with a 138% increase there. We'll get in that in a little bit. I'm kind of skipping ahead, but essentially what I'm about to describe here for the filing patterns follows us into this year, but it started last year, and that is that the first 2 weeks of the month are evictions essentially plateau at a level slightly above the pre-COVID average. And in that third week of the month, filings start to ramp up a little bit. And then we usually see a significant spike on the fourth week of the month. And that kind of switches with how many weeks there are in the month, obviously. But that is the general pattern for this year and last year. It started last year after the pre-eviction notice law got passed, like I said. And we were kind of sort of following a different type of pattern the years prior, 2023 and 2022. So this is essentially what we're looking at here, right? So that's the filing patterns so far. The 2024, like I said, in 2024, we had very low filings in January. And then we see those significant jumps at the end of the month that you see there. For example, in February, you just see that surge hit right there at the end of February. And that follows us into this year. This year is unique as well in that January, like I said, unlike it's sort of like the inverse of last year, is that January had an explosive amount of filings, which resulted in that 138% increase. Right, so we went from having 1,000 cases January last year to 2,500. So the average for last year was at around 1,800 cases per month. The new average for this year is at around 2,000 cases per month. So January is exactly 500 cases above average for this year. What else? And then the other thing I wanted to mention quick, March through April, we essentially saw a flat plateau, for a lack of better terms. We still did see a little bit of a surge at the end of March and the end of April. You see a little bit of an incline, but you don't see that significant jump that you see in, for example, in February this year and May this year as well. You see just like that final week, it just surges completely. But we did not see that in March and April for whatever reason. We still see like a wave pattern where evictions come down at the start of the month and then we rise back up at the end.
If I
But
could,
no like
Ozzy,
sharp spike. What
yeah,
was that?
if I could again, in March of this year, calendar year 2025, Minneapolis shifted over to a 30-day notice requirement, which is the leading explanation for why March is the
Mhm.
one month where we see a drop. I can tell you that when we've had two of these massive shifts now, one January of 2024, one March of 2025, where we went from either a no notice requirement or we had a notice requirement but made it a lot longer. It throws a lot of confusion in the minds of landlord attorneys. to decide when and how they're able to file an eviction. So it really does delay things, and they get a little bit bottled up, I suppose. But that's why March went down. Minneapolis instituted a new 30-day, not 14-day, notice requirement, joining both Brooklyn Center and St. Louis Park. Things that we'll talk about again and again throughout today's session. But that's why we see a green arrow for March and not for any other months this year.
Okay. Yeah, that is interesting to remember now. I do remember that. And that will come up later in my presentation. I was going to talk about it now, but now with that context, that does make sense a little bit more. So, next slide, please. All right, and this is essentially what I just said out loud, just in written form. Maybe we'll just keep this up for a few seconds. And I guess I forgot to mention, overall filings are up 22% this year. So last year, within the same 6 month span, we had 10,000 cases. This year we have 12,000 cases total. So about 2,000 extra cases this year. Yes, yes. Next slide. All right, and then here's a zoom in of February of this year, and this is just sort of to so we can see this pattern of filing that I've been talking about, which is that first week we hit a little bit of a plateau, a little bit of a spike on February 7th, but that gets kind of canceled out by the low filings on February 5th. Same thing for the second week. Those days where you see 5 or 6 filings, that's the weekend, essentially. So, and then the 5 days are Monday through Friday, obviously, that you see the bars there. Second week is more or less the same. We do see a little bit of a spike on the 11th, but then we come back down. And in that third week, you see that gradual increase going from the 17th to the 21st. 21st hitting that peak for the month for that time span. And in that third week, really just surging filings, and then ending there February 28th with 180 filings there, which makes it the peak for the whole month there on that final day, that final Friday. Yep. So next slide. Cool. So here we're gonna get into the pre-eviction, 14-day pre-eviction notice stuff that I mentioned. And here what we're looking at, the top bar graph is the delivery dates for these 14-day notices. And we can already see a pattern there. You see sort of a gradual increase into sort of like the first week. Really, like it looks like the Friday of that first week, where those notices are primarily delivered, April 7th and then May 6th on there. So it looks like they wait just about, like at the end of the week or something like that. And then we see a gradual decrease again, leading into sort of a plateau towards the end of the month. But it's kind of small to see here, but yeah, it's normal for like about 300, 350 of these notices to be delivered on a single day. Obviously, not all by the same landlord. And then sort of that tapers off, just as it tapered in over time, leading into towards the end of the month. And that sort of mirrors what happens with the filings, right? So if we look at the bottom bar graph, that is kind of what we were looking at in the previous slides, which is the filing dates for April and May. But yeah, just as like the 14-day delivery, the 14-day notice delivery dates are sort of centered towards the start of the month, then evictions happen towards the end of the month, that surge that I mentioned. But I will say it's like if like a tenant received their pre-eviction notice on the 14th, or on the 6th, May 6th, for example, there, it's not necessarily the case that they'll get their eviction filed on the 20th. So what I've been seeing is that landlords are giving tenants about 30 days, a whole month to try to sort their things out before landlords start filing the eviction. In some cases, they're even giving them 2 months. So maybe we can envision something where maybe a tenant gets their pre-eviction notice on the 7th of April, and then they see the actual filing in May, a little bit later on. And some landlords are even giving tenants more time than that, which may or may not be as useful as one may may think. Um, but yes. Next slide.
Ozzy, if I could, again, a question. How
Mhm.
do you know when they're giving these 14-day notices? How do you say it like it's a fact. How do you know it?
It's usually attached to the complaint. So they attach the 14-day pre-eviction notice to the complaint, and that's usually dated.
So you dig through each complaint because
Yep.
it's not always in the same place in the complaint. Sometimes it's at the top, sometimes it's at the bottom.
Yep.
Um,
Most of the
and,
time it's at the bottom. Yeah.
and you have to find that and see exactly what it says. So every file, how long does it take to go through a file?
I timed myself like a few weeks ago when we talked about it, and takes me about like 40 to 50 minutes on like a typical like a non-payment case. Obviously, if like,
Whoa, whoa, whoa. 40
tenants
to
have more
50
stuff going
minutes?
on, it takes longer.
Did you say 40 or 50 minutes?
40 or 50 seconds. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was gonna like an hour per file. That's 12,000. That's a lot more hours than we have.
I might have said minutes, my bad.
Yeah, okay. No, that makes sense. And just a thought about the 6th or the 7th, why those days are so commonly ingrained. So most leases, most Minnesota leases have a late fee that doesn't kick in until probably after the 5th. You can pay up to the 5th. And so landlords seem to like to give those notices on the 6th through the 7th. Not every lease is like that. Some leases say the rent's due on the 1st of the month or the 3rd or the 7th, I guess I've seen. I'm not sure why it has to be odd numbers, but there always seems to be odd numbers, the 1st, 3rd, 5th, or 7th that we see. But the 5th is by far the most common one that we run into. So that's probably where the 6th or the 7th, if there was a weekend or something, might
Mhm.
play such an outsized role, is my our best guess.
Yeah, that sounds about right. They give a couple days after the first when rent is due to see if the tenant is going to show up with the rent. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, next slide. All right, and this is essentially what I just said out loud, just in written form. Maybe we'll keep this open just a little bit. But yeah, like I said, landlords are giving tenants more time, more than the 14 days. And again, I've seen sometimes where they're trying to count, landlords are trying to count like a notice that they sent like like last year or something like that, like just like a ridiculous amount of time. And yeah, we kind of talked about at some points why maybe that's not so useful. Seems nice to be given more time, I guess, but again, like yeah, you would assume some type of like enforced timeline with that type of thing. Cool. So next slide. So here we're breaking down this year's evictions between counties. So here we're looking at Hennepin, Ramsey, and then every other county combined. So that other county section also counts part of the metro counties like Dakota and stuff. Um, but if we're just looking at it here, we see that all other counties combined, except excluding Ramsey, is sort of on par, comparable to Hennepin County, in that they both make up, 80% of all cases equally, 40 and 40% for each of those sections. So that is interesting to see there that you can put every other county, excluding Ramsey, their filing rate and compare it to what's coming out of Hennepin. And Ramsey, we just see they're just making up a nice chunky 20% there of all filings. And here we can start to see what Mike was kind of talking about. So if we look at the data table on the right and we move our eyes towards Hennepin County, you can see that Hennepin, other than January, which was kind of like a bonkers month, like I said, we can see that generally Hennepin kind of stays in the 850 range, 850 cases per month. Kind of dipped down in April, but we saw a significant dip in March with 595 cases for that month out of Hennepin, and real no significant changes from all the other months. So Ramsey kind of stays in the 350 range, 350 cases consistently, other than January, which again was a high filing month. Consistently 350 around that range, filings coming out of Ramsey. Other counties in this specific situation is a little bit harder to parse out because it is a mix of metro counties like Dakota and Anoka and then greater Minnesota. But they seem to stay within a specific range as well, right? 750 to about 800 cases, 850 in February. So no real significant changes in every other county except in Hennepin during the month of March, which saw 595 cases, which is 200 filings short of what they usually have. And we can see that sort of play out in the grand total and helping to keep that grand total really low. So again, it goes back to what Mike was saying with the, they switched to the 30-day notice. So that might have caused landlords and their attorneys to have to reacclimate again, and maybe they weren't filing as much. So that does, check out there. Cool. So next slide. Yes. Cool. So here we have it broken down from greater Minnesota and then the 7 metro counties. We see greater Minnesota there with 21% of all cases filed statewide, excuse me. And then we have Dodge all the way down to Anoka, which is that yellow part of the bar there. Uh, Dodge through Anoka, all of these smaller metro counties, they make up about 10% of the bar there. And then Dakota by itself makes up another 10%. But I will say Dakota is actually split up into 3 counties. We won't get into it too much, but they are technically 3 counties put into one. So it kind of does make sense that they make up 10% of that because it is sort of 3 in 1. Ramsey, again, with their nice chunky 18%, somewhat comparable to what's coming out of greater Minnesota, right? So if we had to break it down even further, right, we could say the filing rate that's coming out of greater Minnesota as a whole is comparable to what's going out of Ramsey, right? And then Hennepin again with that chunky 40%. Yep. So next slide. Cool. And this is just what I said again, just in a data table form. And we see again that March number. We can look to see if there's really any significant changes in any of the other metro counties. Doesn't seem like it. Again, it was Hennepin that had that dip in filings in March. Every other county was business as usual. I do see a little bit of a spike during May in Dakota. They went from having like 150, 180 cases per month up to 216 cases, and then 316 in Dakota as well in January. So again, that sort of like, huge surge in filings across the board in all counties. Yes, and then anything after Scott in the metro counties is essentially like really small numbers, so it's not really going to tip the scales in one way or another. And I'm trying to look here again. I feel like I had something else to say, but I don't see anything else. Yes, so we'll skip to the next slide. Cool. So here we're going to start to break down the data by filing reasons. I was looking at this earlier and I was thinking if we took off the years from each of these pie charts, it would kind of look like we're looking at the same thing 3 times. But there is just a little bit slight variation here. So I will start off by saying that this pale blue gray block here on the right, that is non-payment with other reason. And within this block here, I would say 85% of all cases are non-payment with non-payment of utilities, garage, pet rent, some other like money related issue that has to do with the unit. And then the other 15% of within this block here, this gray blue, it's such a weird color block there. The other 15% of that is non-payment with like, some other lease violation like smoking in the unit, unauthorized occupant or pet, some other thing that's sort of making that eviction come through. But yeah, 85% of that block within that range there within that is non-payment with non-payment of some other thing. And then the orange piece on its left, is just non-payment by itself. Cool. And then yeah, you can see all the other filing reasons on there on the screen, but I will explain that 504B.171, that's that blue square there. That is illegal activities. I'll just mention that for the folks that are not maybe familiar with that. That is like illegal activities. That's usually more urgent, so the tenant is like doing some type of criminal activity in the unit. So that's what that stands for. And yeah, and then I'll just say that non-payment and then non-payment with other reason. So those two large chunks, they usually make up 90% of all cases. So yes, it is usually 90% of the time I am just entering like a 40, 50-second entry into the database. So with that said, we can sort of start to look at this a little bit closer. So 2023 is more closely resembling this year. And I say that because if you look at last year and this year, um, we have a little bit less diversity in what types of cases are going out. And you can see that with the gray and the yellow and the blue sort of getting squished together. I know that's not like quantitative, but like you can see it sort of gets smaller there. Yeah, so if we go to the next slide, we can see the raw numbers of these. And we can see the share of non-payment with other reason and non-payment by itself. We can see that share of percentage sort of increase a little bit. Um, so that kind of plays out, obviously if they take up a larger chunk, that's going to push everything else a little bit on the smaller side. And the other thing to say on here is that we saw a decrease in holdover cases this year. So we went from having 455 cases to 384 holdover cases. And that's really the one significant decrease that we actually did see, and everything else increased, obviously. Yep.
So
So
Ozzy,
next slide.
just to sum up the last two slides, almost every eviction's about money, right? I mean, it's about 90% of all evictions, maybe 85, maybe 88%, but it's going to be close to 90% every year of evictions in Minnesota are about money. Is that safe to say?
Yep,
Sorry,
true. Yeah, I muted myself there for a bit, my bad. Yep. So next slide. Cool. So this is the projection part of the presentation. So if we take the average of the past 6 months, times it by 6, and then add it to what we currently have, we get 24,836 total filings, which is higher than last year. Not quite as high as 2023, but higher than 2022, which is post-COVID. And then you can see there 2018 and 2019, that was pre-COVID. And that's kind of like the levels we were expecting or hoping to work towards. Obviously it's not going to happen overnight or over the next year, but we were hoping to trend towards that direction, but it doesn't seem like that's happening. If you guys remember, January this year had many, many filings. We were 500 cases above the average of this year. So if we sort of took a more like positive spin or whatever, and we created a new average excluding January of this year, we still end up with 23,000 cases, 23,749, so upper 23,000, which is still higher than last year and 2022, and just a little bit further away from 2023. And the reason 2023 was so high, by the way, is that that's when the eviction moratorium was expiring. So those renter protections were being, slowly phased out. And with that, we saw more evictions as well, since people weren't really caught up with their rent. Maybe they weren't able to pay that rent, that type of thing. So that is where we're at with the projections. Hopefully, it is not actually going to be 24,000 cases. Um, but that is what we have there. Yes, next slide. Cool. So Eviction Lab is a different organization that also tracks evictions. They do it for like the whole country, but they also track Minnesota. And I'm gonna get into like some something that I'm sort of nitpicking with them, but we'll get to that later on. So what they're showing is 19,560 total cases over the past 12 months. So their scale, we're looking at a different scale now. So we're looking at the last 6 months of last year and the first 6 months of this year. They only collect data once a month at the start of the month. And then yeah, so 19,560 cases. When I pulled through our records, that same time span, we were at 24,806 total filings for that same 12-month span. And then when I looked into the court system, they showed 15,149 total filings. So I think what's going on here is that they are getting everything that the court has on record. And then I pasted some like paragraphs on the right, which explains how they collect the data, how they're able to get this number. And what I got from that is that they access the court system, so they right away have the 15,000 cases, and then they use like bots to like scrape data from the internet, and then they hire like third parties to also find the cases. And so that's how they're landing sort of in between our number and what the court has, is that they're supplementing their data from the court with whatever they're able to scrap on the internet. And then they clean it up and that sort of thing, so there's no duplicates. So that's how they arrive at that number. Kind of interesting to see there. And if we look at on the left over at their chart, we can see that they have a versus baseline. This was kind of like, I was looking at this last night and I was like, how are they getting this? Like, what's going on here? And essentially, what I was reading is that their versus baseline, they're comparing it to the average of 2022 and no, 2023 and last year. So they're not even comparing it to the pre-COVID times. They're basing it off of a new average from post-COVID, right? So that's why these numbers don't look that big. So you see in Minnesota, we're 1% above average right now. Totally not true. Um, we are way above average than where we should be. But if we're taking the average baseline from last year and the year prior, then I guess that's kind of correct. Even then, I'm guessing them missing like a few cases, more than a few cases, is sort of throwing that number off a little bit. And then I'm guessing all the other numbers from the other states are sort of uh, doing the same thing. That's why they don't look as dramatic as maybe they should be. Not too sure what's going on in Rhode Island. But yeah, let's go to the next page, the next slide, please. So here is the same graph that I captured last year when I did this exact same presentation. And you can see there on the left that back then they were using the pre-COVID average, and we got these huge, like dramatic numbers. They're like 24% above average in Minnesota and in some other states like in Delaware, Virginia. Uh, So I don't know why they switched their baseline to maybe not make it so dramatic. I don't think they're being like deceitful about it or anything. But if we were to base our opinions or our thoughts around this, it would kind of make it seem like we're either back at pre-COVID eviction numbers or we're approaching that baseline. But that is definitely not the case from what we saw in the projections page. We're very significantly up above the pre-COVID average.
And Ozzy, one other, I don't think you mentioned this, but when you're looking up files, there are more evictions out there than the ones you actually send letters to, right? Which types of evictions are you counting and which ones don't get a letter from us that you're doing
Sure.
research on?
Sure. So there's foreclosures that get lumped into evictions as well.
Okay,
So
so how do
those
you know it's a
ones,
foreclosure?
I have to open the complaint. I can usually tell because the person that's filing the eviction is like a bank. But I open the complaint and I read like, like tax forfeiture or whatever the thing
Sure.
is. It looks very specific.
And just to
So
be clear, a foreclosure's final phase is an eviction. In the
yep.
same, for instance, in Hennepin County, where they actually have a exclusive designated housing court, the final step of a foreclosure is an eviction. So the actual eviction numbers are quite a bit higher than what Ozzy's reporting. And there's another
Mhm.
exclusion as well, correct?
Yes. Dang, why am I blanking out on this? So
Well,
let
it's
me open up
foreclosures and commercial evictions.
commercial evictions, yes. And then there's some domestic situations which are technically like evictions, but they don't have like a proper like lease agreement. So an example that I can think of off the top of my head that happens more often than maybe people think is like a either like a divorce or like if there's like someone's like in like a domestic relationship with someone else and they
Sure.
break up, the relationship doesn't work or whatever, and the person wants to stay in the house but they don't have a, you know what I'm saying? So it's
I
not like a
do.
lease agreement. I typically wouldn't send out a letter to that because there is no lease agreement, but it is technically an eviction that goes through.
And
Yep.
commercial evictions are fairly common as well, right? Where any
Yep.
business that doesn't pay their rent eventually, that's
Hmm.
what happens. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. Yep. So the number is actually higher, like Mike said, but it is but the number that we were looking at earlier, that 12,000 for the first 6 months, that is evictions with a proper lease agreement, for rent, for services, that type of thing. Yes.
Great. Am I up now? Is that what's going on here?
Yes, you are. Your turn.
I should maybe act less shocked. We had a few questions. Do you want to take what we had sort of at the midpoint of this since Ozzy's portion is done?
Yeah, we can do that.
Go ahead.
All
I'll
right. So
let
we
you
got
fire the ones that we have that just came in. We'll get to the ones that were pre-submitted later.
yes, we've got three questions in the Q&A. First one, are cases for holdovers still being filed? Are they going in favor of landlords or tenants if a tenant has given written notice to the landlord?
Okay, so holdover cases, yes, they are being filed still. They're nowhere near as common as they were during the COVID era. We had a giant surge of holdover cases because it was one of the few ways a landlord could give or file an eviction when non-payment cases were not allowed. Um, and a holdover case can be one of two things. Either the landlord has given the tenant a notice to vacate or notice to quit, or the tenant has said in writing, I'm going to be leaving at the end of this time period, and then they don't. But holdover cases are being filed. Generally, if I'm saying who wins and loses those cases, it's mostly landlords winning those cases. That's just landlords win most evictions or they settle. So those aren't any exception at all.
All right, next question. Does the notice arriving immediately before the upcoming month's rent being due cause issues with accessing rental assistance with the appropriate documentation?
So I think what Sarah is asking there is the 14-day notice, when that is received by the tenant, how much it might say that the tenant owes. So what we see frequently is the tenant's debt changes because a new month, we straddle it into a new month. And so then the next month's rent becomes due as well. In our experience, most of the agencies or entities that offer any financial assistance are well aware that the next month's rent is going to be due when the next month occurs. So it doesn't seem to really hamper one's ability to get the assistance is our take on that.
Last question in the Q&A, and then we got one in the chat we can touch as well. Do you have the current list of cities that have the 30-day notice before eviction requirement?
Right. There are 3 cities right now that have that 30-day notice at present. Brooklyn Center was the first to do that, followed by St. Louis Park. St. Louis Park, an odd tale. They were the actual first city that had any pre-eviction notice requirement at all in the entire state. But it was a 7-day notice requirement. They have since modified it to 30 days to join Brooklyn Center. In Minneapolis now, as of March, as we talked about, is now up to 30 days. St. Paul has on their books a 30-day notice requirement, but it doesn't go into effect until next year, next calendar year. But that'll be the next city that we're aware of. I guess another city could join that very easily if they wished to.
All right, and then last question in the chat. Do you track actual evictions as well as eviction filings? To me, that can go two ways, sort of where the eviction is filed as well as like where the writ was actually issued.
The work that Ozzy does not follow up to find out whether the tenant actually had to move out or not. We have done studies like that in the past. They are very laborious to find out the actual results of the cases. And at this point, they would be heavily skewed because so many cases are expunged now. The expungement rules have changed drastically in Minnesota in the last 5 years, realistically. So it would be really difficult to see exactly what the common results are by trying to track that. It's going to be anecdotal almost by definition.
All right, and with that, that's the questions we have right now. Mike, floor is yours.
Well, let's go on to some eviction laws to start, to get us to where we all have the same baseline knowledge. And then we're going to talk about some theories on why evictions are so high. So number one, we've been talking about this pre-eviction notice requirement a lot, and I know it's the law in Minnesota, and it's been the law actively affecting us since January of 2024. So we're at over a year and a half of this being in play, but it's still new. It still feels new to those of us that are in this field, and a lot of landlords remain a little bit confused when they see this sort of requirement, and they'll do it wrong. They'll do an old version of the 14-day notice requirement. So the law that we care about is at the bottom of the screen, Minnesota Statute 504B, which is the chapter of landlord-tenant law, or chapter of Minnesota law that covers landlords and tenant issues. Point 321, and then subdivision 1A plays an outsized role in that specific statute. And the big change, like I said, happened in January. Oh, I have that wrong. Of 2024 is when it really kicked in. But what it requires is that if the landlord wants to file an eviction for non-payment of rent, which, as Ozzy pointed out, is about 90% of evictions, so almost every eviction is going to be non-payment of rent, the landlord first has to warn the tenant in writing, saying how much is owed, who the tenant is supposed to pay, and also some other really specific, almost scripted language. You don't have to use a form provided by this statute, but landlords have effectively done that. They've just typed the words from the statute. There's a script that you have to follow. And if you don't, you're not complying with the statute as a landlord. So it's not really worth trying to be creative in writing this. You just want to use the language the statute requires. So for instance, it says how to reach out to 211 for potential financial assistance, legal aid as well. This 14-day letter does by statute constitute an emergency for any kind of analysis from some place that might be able to give financial assistance. So like emergency assistance, usually through counties or a bigger area than that, might in the past have said, oh no, a notice from a landlord isn't enough, but this has got more gravitas to it. The landlord must give this notice. They have to send it either by first-class mail or by one person handing it to another. It's not a court case service requirement per se, but it is still personally serving, one person handing it to another. The landlord is allowed to hand this letter to the tenant, unlike in a court case where the landlord could not hand the court papers to the tenant if it's the owner themselves. We've already had this question, but let's go on to the next slide. Yeah, the cities are allowed under the statute specifically to have a longer time frame if they wish. As mentioned, Brooklyn Center, St. Louis Park, and Minneapolis all have 30 days, and St. Paul, middle of next year, will be joining that group as well. Look, when you try to figure out exactly what percentage of the tenants in the state that comprises, it's a little bit complicated to look at census data, but it's going to be somewhere between 20 and 30%, closer to 30% than 20% of Minnesota renters are going to be covered by the 30-day rule. We had a webinar, I believe it was last month, or maybe it was May, where and these are all available online, or you can watch them again, where we were talking about the rise of city ordinances. Some cities just not satisfied with where the law is between landlords and tenants and offering more progressive ordinances if the state won't do it on its own. Landlord-tenant law is almost, in my career, I've been working at this since 1996, has largely been driven, almost exclusively been driven by state law. There's some federal law when it comes to discrimination. Generally, other than that, there's really not. And there's been some city ordinances in the past, but in the last 10 years, there's been a serious acceleration of city protections for tenants. And you'll actually see elected officials or people that are candidates for elected offices running on renters' rights types of platforms, which is not something that was done when I started in 1996, at least not as much as it is now. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So a couple more things that a landlord has to get right when they file an eviction. The current lease has to be attached. This is a change from the past. Leases have, again, going in the Wayback Machine, 1996, when I first started, almost every lease was 2 pages. Well, it was 1 page, front and back, legal size paper. So it was bigger, you know, the longer paper, but it was usually front and back, 1 piece of paper. Now, the most commonly used lease in the state is about 51 pages long. It includes a bunch of addendums, but it's still really long. And so if a landlord wants to file an eviction, they got to attach a copy of the lease to the complaint. So these eviction filings have become much thicker reads. It's not that uncommon to see a 100-page complaint slash lease attached to it in MICRO, the Minnesota Court Records Online, which, by the way, is available to anybody. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to pay a fee. You don't need a super secret password. MICRO is available for anybody that wants to use it. Again, if there's a non-payment of rent case, there's got to be a detailed accounting of what's owed. If there's a breach alleged, the specific lease clause violation has to be listed along with the date, kind of a description of the breach. A breach is some sort of, it's not crime, but it's a violation of the contract. And it also needs to say where the right of reentry clause is, which is one of the telltale signs you'll see of a landlord that has found a lease online that is not Minnesota specific, is it will not have a right of reentry clause, which basically says, if you violate a term of my lease, tenant, I can go file an eviction against you right away. That's required by law in Minnesota, and many other states it's not. The complaint has to mention whether any state or federal subsidy is involved. And if there's a notice to vacate, it has to be attached as well. A lot of these are a lot better. They make it something where the judge can look at the case and probably have a pretty decent understanding of any issues that might pop up before the tenant and the landlord actually show up in court, if the judge were to study these cases in depth before the hearing. All right, let's go on to the next page. So eviction numbers are historically high. Again, I've been at this for a long time. The prevailing thought for how many evictions were filed was somewhere between 12, maybe 17,000 evictions a year, but it kind of felt like it was 15,000-ish as far back as I can remember pre-COVID. And we know how many were filed in 2018 and 2019 because we started doing the work where we would send a letter. This is why Ozzy looks at every one of these files, spends 40 to 50 seconds on each file. We send a letter to each person in Minnesota that has an eviction filed against them that basically says, hey, we have lawyers, we know evictions, give us a call, we'll help you figure out what to do first. What should be your first move here? Maybe there's places that might be able to represent you, like Legal Aid, Volunteer Lawyers Network, Hennepin County's Adult Resource Service, or Representative Services. Maybe there's money that you can apply for. You should contact 211. But we'll also look at the case itself, and we end up giving a lot of advice to tenants that are very likely to be pro se, representing themselves in court as well. So we look at a lot of these, and we always have, but we started sending these letters in 2018. So that's how we are so confident in the numbers that we're talking about. And so again, 15,200 is an honest guess as to how many evictions were filed pre-COVID. Then we had a couple of weird years where we had COVID, and that lowered the evictions substantially. So you'll see that I skipped on this page from 2019 to 2022, 2024, because we had the COVID years where evictions were really hard to file. But in 2022 to 2024, we saw an increase of evictions of about 35%. This year, we're on pace for a 37% increase over evictions from that 15,200 knowable number from 2018, 2019, that average that we have from that time frame. Let's go back to that chart that Ozzy, just go on to the next slide, because we're going to look at that again. So I'm going to walk through a little bit about the time frame here. So again, 2018, 2019, that's where we see our average of 15,200. We have the COVID years where it was really hard to file an eviction. You certainly couldn't just file an eviction for non-payment of rent. So there were almost no evictions filed, relatively speaking. 2022 is when the moratorium started to really phase out. Culminating with July of that year, where it was basically back to business as usual when it came to evictions. We expected, our office certainly did, and I think that places like Legal Aid and people like that thought that there was going to be a massive surge of evictions filed, that landlords that couldn't file evictions for 2 years, that rent was owed for 23 months or something like that, never been paid, that landlords would be rushing to file the evictions. And there was some of that. But what we honestly expected to happen was to sink back down to pre-COVID levels fairly soon thereafter. But as you can see, that hasn't happened. Instead, we found what seems to be a new normal of evictions filed per year. Everything since 2022 on is at least 22,000 evictions a year. And 2023 and this year, projecting well over 24,000. We're continuing to maintain this new high level, which is very concerning, clearly, from a tenant's rights perspective. And I think societally, it's a bad sign for us to see as well. Again, why should you listen to what we have to say? Go ahead and send us on to the next slide. Because I haven't really started theorizing yet. I'm going to in a second. Why should you listen to what we have to say? We advise people, a lot of people. This is how many people we have advised on evictions since 2021. So around, if you take out 2021 again, evictions weren't really happening then because of the moratorium. Although the ones that were happening, very complicated cases. They weren't your standard non-payment of rent cases. Non-payment of rent cases are somewhat predictable in how advice is going to go. It's a matter of looking at the numbers that the tenant owes, how much do they owe, what are they going to potentially qualify for financial assistance, and then we start digging into the payment plan notion with tenants. Is a payment plan possible, knowing full well what most landlords are willing to say yes to when it comes to a payment plan offer and what they probably won't. But we do a high volume of contact, direct contact, whether it's a phone call, which it usually is for evictions, or maybe an email where the tenant has sent us an email. We'll email back and forth, trying to get them what we can if they're not able to talk to us over the phone. So this is why you should, I guess, listen to what we have to say, is because we have a lot of expertise in dealing with this. So factor number one, go ahead and go on to the next slide. There are simply more tenants. Now, you might think that that is just an obvious thing. We've all heard for years, decades, honestly, about how there's going to be a housing shortage in Minnesota because so many people are going to be moving to Minnesota, just looking at the population numbers. But if we're just looking at the difference in the sheer number of renter households between 2010 and 2020, it's about 50,000 more. It's about 50,000 more renter households. And we're in 2025, so we're halfway through the next official census time. So let's tack on another 25. So maybe it's 75,000 more renter households in Minnesota since 2010. But that still doesn't explain our 30 to 35% higher eviction rate. It just doesn't. It's not the same number there. It's not enough to explain that. So what hasn't changed and what has changed? Well, let's talk about what hasn't changed. Number one, go ahead. Yeah. The price for filing an eviction, I don't recall exactly what it cost when I first started in 1996 to file an eviction, but I want to say it was $120. Pretty sure that's right. It was $120. Then there was a brief time where it was 132. And it might have jumped up to 232 at one point. And then we had the Governor Pawlenty years. So I know this dates me now, but to talk about Governor Pawlenty, he's not been the governor for quite some time. He was a Republican two-term governor in Minnesota, and he had a very clear sort of campaign and governing concept, which was, I'm not going to raise taxes at all, no matter what. But fees were very fair game. So all kinds of fees went up dramatically during the Pawlenty administration, including court filing costs, which is when we jumped to the $300 level. So it costs landlords about $300 to file an eviction. It's a little bit different county to county, but not a lot different. It's around $300 for a landlord to file an eviction, and it's been that way since 2009. So that has not changed. It's been very static for 16 years. So that doesn't explain anything about what's changed. Another thing that hasn't really changed a lot is once the case is filed, there's a lot of stuff that has changed dramatically pre-filing in Minnesota. But once the case is filed, the level of change is not anywhere near the same. That 14-day notice requirement was a huge difference maker in how evictions work in Minnesota. So that hasn't really changed enough, substantially enough, to help us reach our theory here. Go ahead and go on if you could. Once again, here's our reminder. Our baseline 2018, 2019 was about 15,000 calls. Now we're doing 22 to 25,000 calls a year. We have pre-COVID, the two big bars on the left. The small bars are the COVID years. Then we go really big bars on the right. Just a quick reminder of what we're looking at. So now let's talk about some things that changed. And some changed back, but some have not. All right, we have our COVID-related eviction moratoriums, sorry. So, contentious topic, landlords that were in this era as landlords still talk about this era. Yeah, and so it is because they were so frustrated that they weren't able to file court cases. It should be noted, this is one of the rare times when a federal law actually had a massive impact on landlord-tenant law in Minnesota. The first, I think Governor Walz's eviction moratorium under an emergency order, predated the federal one, but there was a federal one shortly thereafter. This was during the Trump administration, by the way. So this wasn't some radical left-wing president banning evictions. This was President Trump. You can think whatever you like about him, but I don't think most people would call him a radical left-wing president. Banned evictions for non-payment of rent for a good chunk of time, 6 months or so. And then that kept on. It was renewed briefly. It was part of what's called the CARES Act, which has faded into memory for most people's minds, but it still plays sort of an outsized role in landlord-tenant world because it never sunsetted that portion of the federal statute. But anyhow, that changed. We had all these eviction moratoriums. Then it eventually changed back. All right, so that's no longer there. The 14-day pre-eviction filing notice, that is a change that has stayed. That's the state law, has been since it started. There's no real, as near as I know, legislative momentum to take that law away. At least we've never heard anything about that. And then we have the 30-day pre-eviction notice for certain cities, which will be 4 cities as of next year. That is a change that has not gone back as well. Okay, so let's start talking theories. We already talked about there's more tenants. Okay, so there's that. Next up is, I'm sorry, I have another page of things that didn't change. A lot of eviction cases during COVID, in fact, I'm sorry, all cases during COVID were generally heard online. Zoom hearings became the new normal. That is still true everywhere in the state except Hennepin County. Hennepin County decided, I can't remember which year it was, to start going back in person again. They decided the efficiency from having in-person hearings was so much greater than online. I think that was the justification. that they resumed in-person hearings. I'm of two minds of that for a lot of different reasons, but that's what Hennepin County is doing. Everywhere else in the state, evictions are still being heard virtually. So that is a change that has largely stayed. Another change that I think is part of some of the theories that we have is the sameness of how landlords seem to approach the work that they do, and when they decide to file evictions, what lease they decide to use. As I mentioned, this National Association of Realtors, or NAR lease, if you want to abbreviate it, has taken hold in a weird way in Minnesota. It's honestly not a great lease for landlords. Landlords think it is because it's so lengthy. They figure, hey, if it's 51 pages, I must really have my rights protected for 51 pages. There's a part of it that's terrible for Minnesota landlords, and I'm not going to tell you which one because it helps a lot of my clients. But I will say that it's not the best lease that I've seen for Minnesota landlords, but Minnesota landlords seem to think it is. So the National Association of Realtors, they create a lease that they modify for each state and they customize it to some degree. And like I said, it's the most popular lease that we see. We see this very regularly. I can't give you a percentage on it, but maybe it's 20, maybe 30%. There's no one Minnesota lease. There's no standardized lease, which is what a lot of tenants will tell us when we ask, what lease do you have? And when we finally get a chance to look it over, we'll see that it's maybe this lease or another one that some landlords use regularly in Minnesota. But this mentality of I want the same thing that other landlords are using because it's probably safe if other landlords are using it seems to have taken hold more in, I think, the last 10 years than it had in the first 15 years in my career working with Homeline. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. All right. Number one, I think there was and remains to some extent a lack of trust with landlords and tenants, how landlords are viewing tenants. If a tenant gets behind at all with their rent, I think if you go back to 2017, if a tenant started falling behind, the landlord or the tenant might be able to go to the landlord and say, hey, look, I know I'm behind on rent. Let's see what we can work out to get me caught up before you go file an eviction. I think landlords are a little less likely to be up for that. Again, we have the new phenomenon of out-of-state landlords coming in, maybe as a giant corporate entity, or even bigger than that, where people buy stock in these entities that reinvest by buying rental property. And there's not really any meaningful relationship between the landlord and the tenant in those situations, not like it used to be. Where you might know your landlord's name and their family, and they might know your name and your family. It's a little less likely these days. It's become more corporatized in a lot of ways. It's hard to completely explain that. I think everybody can understand what I'm saying, but it's something that we've certainly seen that shift in that mindset that landlords seem to have. And with corporate mindsets, you tend to do loss minimization, risk management lines of thinking a little bit more than I think you might if you were, an amateur landlord with one half of a duplex that you're renting out. Amateur landlord, I don't mean it as an insult. My definition of an amateur landlord is somebody who hasn't turned pro and that's all they do for a living. So somebody that's an accountant that decides to get a rental property, I don't think of them as a pro. But if they get 10 units, they start to realize it's hard to keep doing that CPA work and the landlord thing at the same time. So they bow out of the other job and become a full-time landlord. That's, in my mind, when they turn pro. Let's go on to the next thought. All right, so there's been effects of COVID on tenants, some long COVID effects, the actual health impacts. But it's not just that. It's not just the impact of COVID on health. It's the impact of COVID on career paths and schooling paths, educational paths, lots of things that have been just thrown off course in people's life plans from COVID. Difficult to quantify, but I can certainly say when I talk to people that are facing evictions, and I talk to, I don't know, 20, 30 people a week these days that are facing evictions, households personally. This still comes up a fair amount when I ask, how'd you get behind? What happened? Trying to figure out how to convince a landlord to say yes to a payment plan. So it really matters for my advising them. But this comes up a lot more than you might think. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Are landlords quicker to file? Has the 14-day or the 30-day notice requirement incentivized landlords to file faster? Well, we heard Ozzy talk about the fact that, not every landlord files the day they're eligible to file. In fact, sometimes it's 30 days or 60 days or several months. We still see, somewhat to our amazement, an occasional, average-ish tenancy. Tenant owes $1,500, something like that, per month in rent, and it's a $30,000 debt. We'll still see those. They aren't as common as during COVID. We used to see a lot of those during COVID when the moratoriums were in place, but we'll still see some of those. Well, the landlord's just kind of hoping that the tenant will make good because it's the only way they figure they'll ever get their money back. But it's a change. The 14-day, 30-day notice is a change from 2019 to where we are now. There's no denying that that part of the eviction logistic process has changed. But so I can't really answer the question. I'm just offering some observations about what's changed. Another thing that's changed, and by the way, these aren't just my theories. I asked for all kinds of staff input. We have 25 people working in our office, a whole bunch of lawyers, law students that are working with us for the summer, and other people that have been in the industry for a long time doing organizing work or advocacy work. And we just sort of brainstormed about this. And one of the things people came up with was it's a lot easier for an attorney to represent a lot more landlords now. It didn't used to be the case. First of all, there are more landlord attorneys now than there were pre-COVID. There's no question. Now, that's not true during COVID either, that landlord attorneys didn't spring up then, but post-COVID, suddenly we have a 35% increase in the number of evictions being filed. There's more work for lawyers to do if landlords want to hire lawyers, which they don't always have to do, depends on where they're at and how they have their business designed. But I think more landlords are hiring lawyers, and there are more lawyers available to do this. And unquestionably, lawyers are able to cover more geographic area than they used to be able to do. We didn't used to have Zoom hearings pre-COVID. And so a landlord lawyer can do a much higher volume of cases, and they can be heard all around the state very easily. You don't have to be anywhere specific to do a Zoom hearing. So unless they're solely working in Hennepin County, the ability for landlord lawyers to appear throughout the state, I think, has an impact on the number of cases, because I think it sort of starts to drive this automated feel that landlords have. On the 6th, we're going to send this 14-day notice or a 30-day notice, and then 5 days after that, we're going to go file the eviction because that's what our lawyer told us to do, and that's been working for us for a while now, so that's what we're going to keep on doing. So it starts to become a little bit factory-like, and I think the fact that there are more lawyers representing landlords is certainly an undeniable fact, and probably has contributed to why the numbers are as high as they are. Which brings us to the last theory. It's just the economy. So vacancy rates, out of every 100 apartments, how many are available at any one time? They've ebbed and flowed in my career, but not much. There was a brief time after 9/11 where vacancy rates were terrible for landlords, 10, 15%, depending on the market you were in. But generally, it's been between 1% and 5% during most of my career. So out of every 100 apartments that are in a certain area, 95, 97, 99 of them are rented at any one time. And that's still pretty accurate in Minnesota throughout most of the state. There's pockets where it's a lot better for landlords and pockets where it's a lot worse, or better for tenants or worse for tenants, depending on your point of view. Rents have increased. Unquestionably, rents have gone up throughout the state. And again, regional or pocket areas, you'll see even greater spikes. But one thing that we see, because I guess we ask this question, when a tenant talks to us about an eviction, we ask how much the rent is. And we try to figure out a rough guess as to how much their income is as well. So we can see the income to rent ratio. And we notice very often that it's not the 30% that the government recommends that somebody spends on their housing costs, whether it's rent or mortgage, but it's 50% or maybe 70% of their income is being spent on rent. And so maybe the answer to why there's so many evictions is a combination of all of these things, and maybe some others that I haven't thought of or that our office didn't think of. And I guess we're not necessarily trying to spur a conversation. We only have 40 minutes and we still have a few questions that we have to get to. But happy to hear any other theories on why people think the eviction numbers are as high as they are. But make no mistake about it, they are as high as they are. And they are a lot more than they used to be pre-COVID. So whether it's policy changes that need to occur or what it might be, it seems like we can do better because if you take the given that having a giant number of evictions in a society is bad, which I firmly believe, if that's bad, not only can we do better, we have done better in the past. And somehow it's important for us to get hopefully to that level and maybe even lower. Every eviction is somebody's family's home being threatened with being lost. And so they're all a big deal, but the numbers are just unignorable. Okay, I'm gonna have a drink of something and Philip, what are we on to next? Which questions do you want to go with? I'll let you pick.
Yeah, so let's do the pre-submitted ones, and then we can wrap around, finish up with the Q&A questions.
Sure.
All right, so give me 1 sec to pull them up here.
Yep.
All right, so we've got 11 pre-submitted questions, and we'll start at the top and work our way down. So question 1 for 14-day non-payment notices: has there been successful argument notices can become stale if multiple months have elapsed?
Yeah, so this is a weird thing that we see now and again, where a landlord will give a notice in January. Let's just use that, saying, "Hey, tenant, you're behind on rent. Here's your 14-day written notice. You owe us $1,000. Let's say that's the total number you owe." And then they don't file the eviction for 6 months, and there's no new notice given. There's no new 14-day notice. And so we've seen cases where the judges dismissed the case or the referee and said, "Hey, that's just too stale. You got to have a current one, give them a new one." I think there's probably an argument. Again, if you give that 14-day notice on July 16th, right? And then the 14 days are up and you're into August, everybody's going to understand, I think, that you can file an eviction on August 3rd or 4th or whatever. Even though August rent is due, you don't have to give a new one. But once you get into September, it starts to look a little iffy that you're straddling 2 months. If I were a landlord or a landlord lawyer, I'd be saying, yeah, let's give that 14-day notice at least within the last 1.5 rental periods, just to be on the safe side. And look, a landlord filing eviction is no money maker for them. Landlords lose money on evictions too. They'd rather not file evictions. So if they can avoid those, it's better for both sides.
All right, question 2. Can a renter be exempted after 3 applications and background checks from paying more fees until an apartment is found for them?
Yeah, I'm not sure where this question comes from, the 3 application and background check, if they just think that's a good idea or not. I haven't seen a rule exactly like that before. There are some other states that allow tenants to use a background check if they've been denied within a certain amount of time to show to the next landlord. But it's not a rule in Minnesota. Every landlord can say, no, I want to see a new background check with the company that I use. There's about 10 companies at any one time that seem to exist. So short answer is no.
All right, question 3. Is the 14-day pre-eviction notice required to be mailed after a failure to vacate, after a month advance notice to vacate?
Yeah, I'm not sure I follow the sequence of that question. I remember looking at that one before, trying to figure out exactly what they're asking. But it seems to imply that there's some sort of notice that has to be given before the 14-day notice has to be given, I think. And the short answer is no to that one. It's just the 14-day notice. A lot of tenants will call us up and think, hey, the landlord can't evict me. They haven't given me a month's notice before they file the eviction. Again, Minneapolis, Brooklyn Center, St. Louis Park now have that rule in place for non-payment of rent cases. But in general, the answer is no to that.
Great. Next question. Why are some landlords able to include future rent, payments, charges, etc., for future months in structured settlement agreements?
So what I'm assuming with this question is we're talking about structured settlement agreements in court, where the judge in the court has sanctioned these settlement agreements, basically. So the tenant owes $5,000. They pay $1,000 on the day of court. They still owe $4,000 more, but they're not going to be able to get caught up till the end of October, let's say. And they want to make 8 payments between now and the end of October. Well, you know what? August rent's going to come due on August 1st. September rent's going to come due on September 1st. So we factor that in to the total amount the tenant's going to owe. So courts are fine with that. Tenants seem to be fine with it because it gives them time to catch up. Landlords are fine with it, but you can't ignore the coming rent due simply because there was a court case. So yeah, that's why those are included.
All right, next question. I've been threatened with eviction for asking questions which substantially annoyed the property management. Is that legal?
Yeah, I think this question is asking about the generic concept of retaliation. Can the landlord retaliate against a tenant for asserting their rights as renters? And the short answer is it's a very complicated question. This is one of those things where it's much better to simply call our tenant hotline and talk to one of our advocates, which is free, and or send an email. We have our free email and attorney uh, service available as well. And we'll dig in deep to figure out what kind of footing you might have.
All right. What are the requirements for notice to enter a tenant's unit?
So this has changed in recent times as well. It used to be in Minnesota that a landlord had to give, unless there was an emergency, like a fire, gas leak or something, unless there was an emergency, the landlord had to give reasonable notice before they could enter the rental unit. That has been redefined, reasonable, as 24 hours in Minnesota as of January 1, 2024, when a whole bunch of new landlord-tenant laws came into place in Minnesota. That's the current rule. 24 hours notice, unless there's an emergency. The landlord also has to have a reasonable business purpose for entering. They want to fix something. They want to check the furnace filter. You're moving out at the end of August and they want to show it to a prospective new tenant. Those are all valid business reasons. There's some others as well, but those are the common ones we get calls about.
All right. Does email count as written notice for a lease ending? What to do if the tenant's lease is up and they haven't paid rent?
So there's two questions there. What do I do about it? Or does an email count as a written notification of a lease ending? Maybe, usually, but not not for sure is the short answer. So the law doesn't say it. It talks about written notice being required. So it's got to be in writing. An email can be in writing, but my advice on that is generally the longer, the more stable the email relationship is between the landlord and the tenant. What I mean by there is this the first email either side has ever sent to the other side? Or the first text, which is even a tougher question, by the way, is a text sufficient notice? Texts are seen as less substantial than emails by courts. But we've seen courts uphold both texted and emailed notices from either the landlord to the tenant or vice versa. Again, the longer you can show that there's been back and forth communication using that form of communication, the more legitimate the court seems to think it is for all kinds of notices.
All right, next question. Are we going to see an increase in tenant or landlord rights in the coming years?
Wow. Where is the magic 8 ball? I don't know. If I'm betting that we're going to see substantial changes at the city levels in the next few years. I would be surprised if we don't, because cities have decided, again, there are council members that are candidates that will run, and that might be the single biggest plank in their platform when they're trying to convince somebody to vote for them. And we are seeing an increase in what are called renter majority cities. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park. I think there's a couple other metro ones now that there are more renter households than there are non-renter households. And so I think in those geographic areas, the ground is very fertile for more progressive rights for tenants going forward. When I say rights for tenants going forward, when we see the law shift in landlord-tenant law, it's almost always in the tenant's direction. But it's important to understand why that is. Leases are always written by the landlord, and the law simply knows that in every state. It doesn't matter how red or blue the state might be, in every single state in the United States, the law is aware The landlords write the leases, and the tenants don't have a lot of negotiating power over clause number 13 or whatever. In general, there's not much power at all to renegotiate one of these contracts. So the law overrides or supersedes the lease. We just got a question about when the landlord is allowed to enter. And we still see leases that say something other than that, that gives the landlord seemingly more power to enter the rental unit whenever they'd like. But the law overrides those leases. So I think the law is in a constant reactive state to increasingly pro-landlord leases. Again, those 51-page leases, it's not 51 pages about what's great for the tenant. It's almost all written to benefit the landlord. And the law tries to keep up. And so I think the law has to keep shifting because these leases keep growing and keep offering new clauses to protect landlords. And so I think we'll see new laws at the state level. I think that's a lot harder to predict.
All right, next question. How can tenants hold landlords more accountable for harassment and enabling tenants to harass whistleblowers?
Yeah, again, I'm not exactly sure what we're talking about there. This might be one of those things where it'd be good to call our tenant hotline. This feels a little bit like a retaliation issue as well. So yeah, give us a call on that kind of question.
All right. What do we do if property managers don't do what they said they would do, but the resident has already signed the lease and has moved in?
I'm sorry, I don't follow that question at all. It's not your fault, Philip. You're just reading what came in, but I don't know what the tenant's asking. Give our tenant hotline a call on that one.
With a non-renewal of a lease, is the written notice mandatory before eviction proceedings?
The way the question is written, I think the answer is yes. Some leases simply end when they end. There are 5% of leases that we see. A 12-month lease is a pure 12-month lease with no notice requirement for either side at the end of the contract. So they occur, and I guess if the tenant don't leave on the last day of the 12th month, that the landlord can file an eviction for holding over at that point. So in that case, no written notice would be really required, even though it was sort of in the lease. But most leases say some notice is required, and if that's true, a written notice would have to be given by one side to the other in advance.
All right, and that is sort of the end of our submitted questions. We'll move on to the Q&A here. All right, so first question, do the filing numbers factor in eviction filings that are canceled due to the resident moving out after starting the eviction process, but before the court date?
Yeah, short answer here is what Ozzy is capturing, the numbers that Ozzy is presenting with us today are how many cases were filed. He's not telling us which ones were dismissed once they were filed or who won the case. It's how many were filed. That's all that's really answering. And so we wouldn't know with Ozzy's numbers if the case was settled before court, at court, after court. If the landlord won or the tenant won, we're just talking about filing numbers, which, look, that's not as bad as somebody losing their home, but an eviction being filed against somebody is a pretty big deal, a pretty big event in their life. So I don't want to minimize it at all.
Okay. All right, next question. I had a question about what counts as proper notice to vacate when lease end date is approaching. Does email count, or does it have to be a mailed letter? I think we've already kind of answered this one.
Yeah, we talked about that as well. The mailed letter part, it doesn't have to be, if you hand somebody a notice to vacate, that's just as good. It doesn't have to be mailed or certified mail or anything like that. Some leases actually do say any notices have to be given in this way. And in those situations, I think they have to be given in that way. But it depends on the lease there.
It looks like we have a clarification or a follow-up on the structured settlement question. So it says sometimes future rent is included when all past due has already been paid. For example, $1,000 due after court, $3,000 to redeem tenancy by last day of current month. Then stipulating that the following month be paid by the first or writ can be filed. Occasionally, there have been cases where 3 future months are required on time at risk of writ when there is no longer past due rent being paid off in increments. Why would this be allowed by housing judges?
Okay, so to start, I'm not sure that every housing judge would allow this if I understand the question completely. the question is basically saying the tenant's going to redeem completely during 1 month, and then the settlement agreement will continue to hold the power of a writ over a tenant's head for subsequent months after that, unless the tenant complies. All right, to start with, judges don't agree to settlement agreements, not really. Landlords agree to them. I mean, the judge will rubber stamp them at the end, but the landlord has to agree first. That's the first hurdle to any settlement agreement that goes much beyond giving the tenant 7 days to come up with the money, which the judge has the power to authorize on their own. But if the landlord is willing to give the tenant more than the 7 days, they have a lot of negotiating power at that point. Again, most landlords want to get the tenant current, back on rent, and almost every time we see a settlement agreement that goes into subsequent months, it's so the tenant can get caught up to finally redeem at some point. And then once that final payment is made, the case gets dismissed and potentially expunged as well. So I don't see a lot of what this case is describing. I'm not saying it's impossible, and I'm not even saying it's necessarily illegal. I think judges would generally frown on this, but so it's, I guess, answering parts of this completely and other parts of it with maybe this would be okay to a judge, but I think they'd try to discourage it.
All right, and last question here. There are many Spanish-speaking only tenants, yet there are no leases purely in Spanish. What can landlords or tenants do to protect themselves here?
Yeah, so if you're a tenant, you don't speak if you don't speak English, you're fluent in another language or you're not, but you don't speak English or you can't read English. That doesn't mean you don't have to abide by the contract. If you sign the contract, the general contract rules in Minnesota, and I think most of the United States, if not all the United States, is that you're held to that contract. Some of the leading cases on that notion predate recent waves of immigration, where we had a much higher percentage of our population that was illiterate, and people would simply X contracts, indicating their agreement. They couldn't even sign their name. They didn't even have a signature. It would just be an X that they'd mark on the contract. And court cases that I can remember looking at from like the 1940s said, you put your X down, you've agreed to every term in that contract. And so from a landlord's perspective, if you're worried, hey, I didn't provide the speech or the lease in Spanish, there's no law that requires you to do that. And if you wanted to create a lease that is easily understandable by your customers, then you can certainly hire somebody to help you translate it, because you want tenants to follow your rules. That's, again, why most landlords put into leases what they put in, is they want the tenant to comply. So if you're hoping that your tenant will be able to follow your contract, make it as understandable as you can, but no law requires you to provide it in Spanish as well.
All right, and that's our sort of last question here. Looking at next month, we're doing a sort of back to school special, how to navigate the college rental market, right? So mid-August, students should be signing their first leases for apartments. And so we've partnered with University of Minnesota Student Legal Services. One of their attorneys, Shana Jimenez, will be joining us to talk about sort of college-specific issues that students moving into their first apartment off campus typically face. So August 13th at 1:30, and we have a QR code. You can just scan it on your phone and register today if you'd like.
Philip, if I could, those folks over at the University of Minnesota Student Legal Services, they do a lot of landlord tenant work. So this is going to be a high level. I'm sure they're going to make it understandable and mentally digestible, but they do a lot of this. They've done a lot of work on legislative changes over the last certainly 10 years as well. So I'm sure this will be really good. There is another question about the CLE code as well in the chat I just saw.
Oh yeah, so we haven't gotten the CLE code yet. When the recording goes up on our website, we should have the CLE code on there as well, so you can register it. But other than that, thank you everyone for attending. We'll leave this QR code up for a minute or two. So if you want to, you can scan it on your phone to register, but otherwise, thank you for coming today.